For this edition of Audio History, we're going to talk about the Advent Loudspeaker. The Advent Loudspeaker has a position in the history of audio that I think is in some ways unmatched. My personal thinking is that there's a lot we can learn from it, and that's partially because I think in many ways the Advent Loudspeaker is one of the fundamental starting points for high-end audio. We're here, in part, I'm arguing, because of the Advent loudspeaker. So, why do I say that? Have you even heard of the Advent loudspeaker? If you're above the age of 50, maybe, but if you're younger than that, you have no idea. Advent Corporation was a loudspeaker manufacturer started in 1967 by, at the time, a well-known speaker designer named Henry Kloss. Kloss had started, or was one of the founding members of Acoustic Research back in the 1950s, and Acoustic Research was the company that pioneered the acoustic suspension loudspeaker. That's making the box relatively small and sealing it and working out the parameters of the mass of the speaker and the magnet strength and the size of the box and so on, so that you still got good low frequency response. The insight of the acoustic suspension movement, if you will, started by Acoustic Research, was that power amplifiers were getting bigger. I don't mean physically bigger, I mean it was easier to obtain higher power than it had been in the past. Part of what you have to remember is in the 1950s, we're only talking about 20 years or less after the invention of the amplifier. So we're pretty early in the history of electronics, and things were changing in consumer electronics and in amplification fairly quickly. A lot like the computer industry was in its early days. I mean, honestly, the computer industry is still changing pretty rapidly, and we can talk about whether audio is still changing pretty rapidly. But anyway, acoustic suspension was a big deal in the 1950s and the 1960s, and with the advent in the 60s of transistor amplifiers, the idea that low-cost, high-power amplification was going to be possible was made a reality. Kloss, who had worked with Ed Vilcher at Acoustic Research, went off with two other colleagues to form a company called KLH. We previously did an audio history episode on the AR4X and the KLH Model 17, which were important entry-level speakers of the early to mid-60s. Even longer than that. A lot of us got started on one of those two speakers on our hi-fi journey. But Kloss then went on to form Advent Corporation. His idea originally wasn't to build a loudspeaker. His idea was to make a video projection system so that you could have a giant TV on your wall. That's still kind of a deal. Still a fairly relatively rare phenomenon. But imagine at the time where a 19-inch or a 21-inch or a 25-inch tube, TVs were based on tubes back then, was the diagonal size of the screen. 25 inches was big screen. So you can see why Kloss was excited about the idea of projection video and making much, much larger screens, 80, 100 inches perhaps. But he realized it was going to take a lot of money to finance the effort to do projection video, and as he was an ace loudspeaker designer, he went off and designed the Advent loudspeaker so that you could sell a bunch of speakers, generate some cash, and use that cash to finish the development of the projection tube design that he had done. The Advent Loudspeaker sounds, therefore, like something he just, whipped off in the middle of the night for the heck of it. But honestly, Henry being Henry and maybe being almost a genius in the world of low-cost, high-performance loudspeakers, he made something that turned out to be completely and utterly brilliant. The Advent Loudspeaker, I believe, launched in 1970, and it was priced at around $112. This was the beginning of the inflationary period of the 70s, so if you look up the price of the speaker, you're going to see all kinds of different numbers, not wildly off the charts, but apparently they moved the price from $112 to $116 at some point, which sounds like nothing, but apparently was a big deal then. And you can kind of understand that because honestly, $110 loudspeaker is kind of like $1,000 loudspeaker now. So to put that in context, if you think today about loudspeakers that are $2,000 a pair, the Advent loudspeaker kind of occupied the same position in the market. One big difference, though, was there weren't speakers at $50 and $25, whereas today you have no trouble buying a pair of speakers for $250 or a pair of speakers for $100. But the market didn't go down on the underside of where the Advent loudspeaker was priced that far. Yes, you could buy cheaper loudspeakers, but not that much cheaper. So in relative terms, the Advent loudspeaker was one click, I'm going to say, above a good entry-level speaker like the AR4X or the KLH17. The amazing part about the Advent loudspeaker, though, it's a 10-inch two-way, by the way, just so you know what we're talking about. Compared to those other speakers I've mentioned, relatively large box, but what today would be, 2 feet by 15 inches by 12 inches deep or something like that. I don't have the exact measurements, but that's approximately right. So it's a box speaker, 10-inch two-way. There's really nothing technically super special about it until you begin looking at the details and looking at what people who listened to it at the time, including me, noticed. And there were a couple of things that the Advent loudspeaker did that I think can be reasonably said to have kicked off the high end. Sure, there was a high end way before 1970. There were Klipsch and Bozak speakers back in the 50s. Marantz was cranking away making, 8Bs and Model 7 and the Model 9s and tuners that Dick Sequeira was involved with and really, really fancy stuff. But that isn't really what I think got the high end going. Without products like the Advent loudspeaker, and I'm going to say specifically without the Advent loudspeaker, I don't know that things would have gotten off the way they did. So what did the Advent loudspeaker do? Well, one thing it did was bass. And I'm not talking about prodigious bass output. It just had a bass balance that was more solid between, let's say, 50 and 100 hertz. It would go below 50 hertz, but we're talking about low to mid bass. It just did a better job in that region of staying relatively flat down to quite low frequencies. And compared to other speakers that you would have thought about in that $100 plus or minus range, it had what was noticeably and obviously outstanding bass just in terms of a reasonably balanced level. What it also did, though, and I think this is really important, was the bass had better definition than some of the competing speakers that sold at higher prices. I'm specifically going to call out Acoustic Research's flagship AR3A. The AR3A sounded turgid and muddy in many demonstration scenarios. It had plenty of bass, but the bass didn't seem that high quality as it was demonstrated at the time. I don't necessarily mean that the speaker was flawed, because I'm going to talk more in a minute about how much we didn't know about how to make audio systems work. But anyway, in a lot of ways, it was easy to sit down and listen to the Advent loudspeaker at $100 and think, that decimates the AR3A, which is a significantly more expensive speaker. So good bass that was tuneful and musical it seemed like a breakthrough. I'll tell you that. What was also nice was that you didn't get the bass and then not have the mid-range that is super important to really realistic, detailed musical presentation. The mid-range was good, and I think part of that is due to the fact that Kloss did an interesting thing, which is he made a relatively large two-ring tweeter design. So yeah, while it was a two-way, it was, I don't know, I'm making up this term, but let's call it a 2.5 way. It allowed him, really, the fundamental thing is it allowed him to move the crossover between the tweeter and the woofer down to 1 kilohertz. That's a very low crossover for a two-way. You kind of need that with a 10-inch bass driver, but he kind of needed the 10-inch bass driver to get decent bass. So you can see how this kind of cascades and how he, as an innovative loudspeaker designer, a guy doing his own drivers, not just integrating them into a box, he had the insight that he had to put this together as a system that really made sense. But by designing this double ring tweeter system, I think he was also able to get pretty decent, I mean, they weren't outstanding, but pretty decent high frequencies and a good, acceptable high frequency balance. So we've got a speaker for $100+ that's got good bass, which was really hard to do back in the day, and very nice, very musical mid-range, and reasonable treble without any super obvious flaws. I went back and read Gordon Holt's review of the Advent in Stereophile, and he said, and you know, we had limited references back then, so you just gotta cut Gordon a little bit of slack. He said it was essentially a characterless loudspeaker. And he said, you know, I thought it was kind of funny, at least. He said, yeah, at first I thought like it was characterless and therefore bad, but then I thought about it for a minute and listened to it longer and longer and longer, and I was like, oh yeah, characterless is good. This is revealing the music and revealing what the other components in the chain are like. I want that. I like that. That's a desirable feature. About a year later, in issue 1, volume 1, issue 1 of The Absolute Sound, the inaugural issue of our magazine, Harry Pearson reviewed the large Advent speaker. At that point, I think it was called the large Advent speaker. They made a smaller one to, I don't know why, because it wasn't that big a speaker. But anyway, they made a smaller one, and I think they were trying to hit a little bit lower price point. But anyway, Harry Pearson reviewed the Advent loudspeaker, and he discovered while he was reviewing it an option of doing stacked Advents, putting them one atop the other. And, you know, this were early days, but Harry was frankly blown away by how good they were. His point of comparison, and interestingly, a point of comparison that Gordon Holt also used, was the KLH Model 9. I say that in reverential tones because the KLH Model 9 was in some ways obviously the best speaker on the planet at this point in time. It was a full range electrostatic. You could put them side by side in 2 speakers per channel arrangement. And it had been designed in partnership with Jansen, who is still a famous, he's passed away, but his son carries the torch of their work on electrostatic loudspeakers. It was a giant tower speaker. It's roughly 6 feet tall. And like a lot of electrostatics, it sounded gorgeous. It wasn't perfect. We know a lot about the acoustic effects of electrostatics, pro and con, but it just did things that other loudspeakers of the late 1960s didn't do. So comparing the large Advent to the KLH Model 9 is like comparing a Mazda Miata to a Ferrari or a Porsche. It's just like you're talking about completely different territory. And yet, Harry's point was the stacked Advents held up in the comparison pretty well. Not perfectly, but amazingly close at a fraction of the cost. $200 a pair versus $2,000 a pair. And people's expectations were not to pay $2,000 or maybe $20,000 in 2022 money for a speaker. So you gotta know that the KLH-9 was like, it was super exotic. So he started that comparison, and that got people thinking about what is this and what's going on, and it got them thinking about a couple of things. First of all, it got them thinking about setup. And that's a really fundamental thing. You can't, well, maybe you can. It's hard to imagine in the 1960s, you went and bought a speaker and you kind of brought it home and put it on the floor. The whole movement of stands and the relationship of the tweeter to ear height or the mid-range to ear height and location in the room and all of those things was just mostly unexplored territory. But Harry and he didn't invent the stacked Advents, but Harry publicizing the stacked Advents and talking about it got part of the high-end movement of setup and arrangement of the speakers, and the whole setup of all your equipment matters. The second thing he mentioned was, he said, these sounded really good, and that got me to thinking I ought to bring out the state-of-the-art power amplifiers that I now have and I'm reviewing for the Absolute Sound, the Phase Linear 700, 350 watts per channel, which still is a fairly big number, but in 1971, 1972, in the case of Harry, that was a mind-blowing amount of power. 35 watts per channel or 50 watts per channel was a fairly big power amplifier in the day. And 350 watts per channel was just monster. He also used the Crown DC300, which was really the first truly high-powered amplifier in the sense of being 2 times maybe what the most powerful existing amplifiers were at the time. Anyway, he got the big guns out, put them on the Advents, and said, wow, this is interesting. This speaker, this kind of entry-level speaker, is fully capable of revealing many of the assets of hooking up different amplifiers and trying them out. I can hear the difference between the DC300 and the Phase Linear, and I can tell the benefits of increasing power, and I think he blew the fuses or the tweeters or something in the Advents, so he was definitely testing the limits, but he experimented with different fuses and so on and could really suss out the benefits and the differences between equipment, and he thought that was a hallmark of a speaker that must be, at a minimum, pretty darn good. So, if I generalize that, the large Advent loudspeaker can be thought of as kind of a beginning of the high end because of three things. One is it introduced a huge number of people. This is a high volume in terms of sales speaker of the time. So lots of people had this speaker. It was the speaker you wanted to have if you were on a budget, if you were a teenager or college student or a recent graduate. This was the go-to opportunity, and it introduced them to something that was really good and really engaging. Secondly, that feature of being able to reveal what other equipment did encouraged a lot of people to start down the path of checking out other equipment and upgrading and going through what can be a fun and exciting process of testing other equipment and trying stuff out and trying to make your system better. And oddly, I think this element of characterlessness also fed that, which was the speaker didn't really color the sound. And if you wanted to warm it up a little bit or do some other stuff, you had to experiment with other equipment or switch speakers. How do I know? I had large Advent loudspeakers, and I was like, oh, well, to make the sound better, I clearly have to change speakers. And, 5 or 8 speaker switches better, I began to wonder if I was losing my mind, because almost everything you would try at only a little bit more money was not better. And I learned the lesson that I should have been focusing on amps and preamps and cartridges, because these were the days of turntables only, cartridges and turntables vastly more than I was on the speakers, because I had the right answer as for a certain restricted budget, which as a college student you tend to be on a restricted budget. Anyway, I sort of learned my lesson the hard way by trying switching other equipment, but it gets you going in the hobby and it gets you working on building your system. And by introducing so many people to that path, the large Advent loudspeaker and Henry Kloss are the man and the speaker we owe a lot to. We also owe a debt of thanks to Gordon Holt and honestly Julian Hirsch at Stereo Review, who a lot of people like to dump on, but I think he kicked the whole what is Advent and what is the Advent loudspeaker thing off. But Gordon Holt and Harry Pearson were also part of this overall process that was fundamental to the origins of high-end audio. We're going to use a picture, and I'm going to post a link to an excellent article that has a clear, modern digital image of the original large Advent loudspeaker, and also has a wiring diagram for how stacked Advents work, and a nice description of the speaker and some additional historical details. So check that out in the show notes. There's also coverage of both KLH and Advent in the Absolute Guide to High-End Audio, the loudspeaker edition of the book. And I hope you enjoyed this. For more audio history and audio basics and equipment reviews and interviews with industry players and musicians, please subscribe. It really helps us out, so if you'll click on the subscribe button, we'd really appreciate it. And again, thank you for watching.